So I want to talk to you guys today about building static sites with React. But first, just a little bit about myself. As was just said, I'm a software engineer at this small security startup in San Francisco. I rebuilt basically all of our front ends in React, rebuilt all of the things, and really fell in love with React over the past year. So I love React, and I'm using it everywhere. And I used it to even rebuild our marketing website, which is it's essentially a static site, which is what we're going to talk about. And it doesn't do anything special, but I wanted to use React because I love it. It's great. If you happen to go to our site, you use any sort of plugin that analyzes the tech that's being used, you'll see that we are using nothing but React. But at the same time, if you turn off JavaScript, the site is going to work just fine. And that's partially what I'm here to talk about. So, static sites. Who here heard that we were going to be talking about static sites and got excited? Anyone? Oh, excellent. I want to hang out with all of you. That's more than I expected, because static sites aren't that sexy, or at least I didn't think so. They are to me. They make me super excited. But I don't think a lot of people think of it that way. Anywho, so we're going to talk about static sites, and for those of you that didn't raise your hand, I hope by the end of this I can convince you that there's some really cool stuff happening in the space of static websites and React. So, what does the combination of static and React look like? That's a few months ago, I was asking myself that question, and this was me, just kind of wondering what the intersection of static sites and React looked like. As I wasn't sure, I did a bunch of research, I looked at the ecosystem, and what I found was a number of people using React for static sites, but they weren't doing exactly what I thought was possible and should be done. So I decided to dig deeper, and that's what we're eventually going to get into. But before we get into all that, why it's so great to build static sites with React, first I want to zoom out and just think about for a second a question that I like to ask myself whenever I'm looking at new technology, which is, what are we trying to accomplish? If we're building a website, if I'm building a site, whether it's static or dynamic or whatever, if I'm building a product on the web, what do I want to accomplish? So, I'm sure everyone has a different list of things they want to accomplish with their product, but for me, here are some of them. So I want it to be indexable by search engines. I want whatever I build to be able to be found online. This is, if you're building any sort of public-facing website, I assume you want this as well. We want people to be able to find our sites. We want users. We want growth or traction or money or whatever it is. It likely has to do with people on our website. And thus, we really want our websites to be accessible to search engines, which is something we, as JavaScript developers, kind of broke at one point or another over the past 10 years. I also want to be performant. And when I say performant, I mean two things. One, I want it to load quickly. So if I'm on a 2G connection with limited bandwidth on some old piece of crap phone, I want it to still load, and I want that user to be able to see our content and not, swipe away within the first 30 seconds because the page is just loading web fonts or loading JavaScript or doing whatever. I want to be performant that way. But also I want to be performant in terms of scalability. And scalability is kind of a loaded term in our field, but all I mean is that I want it to support a bunch of HTTP requests without me having to really worry about it. And notably, without me having to spin up 1,000 EC2 instances and spend thousands of dollars a month on hosting. I want to be relatively cheap. If I'm a startup and I'm bootstrapping or it's a side project, I don't want to worry about that stuff. So I want to be performant in terms of scaling and in terms of the user experience. I also want to be secure. This is, relatively secure, because nothing is really secure. But if you have a static site, you don't have a back end. So there's nothing to try to break into there, except maybe your web server. But as we'll talk about a little bit later, you can just throw your static site up on someone else's host, and then it's their problem. So less stuff to worry about is always something I like. And I want it to be easily deployable. I want to be able to just git push, like Heroku gives you with dynamic apps, or like continuous integration will do if you set it up to work with GitHub. I just want to git push. I want my stuff to be online super quick. And I also don't want there to be any downtime. I don't want to worry about my site not shutting down properly and then restarting. I don't want to worry about process management. I just want it to work because I want to build product. I don't want to worry about that stuff, at least not yet. So, as you may know or have guessed, these are all things that static gives you out of the box. Static is great for search engines, for performance, for being more secure than a lot of other stuff out there, and for really easy deployments that have zero downtime because it's just a file. But those are all sort of end-user facing features or product features, which are extremely important. But as a developer, I also want a suite of other features related to my own experience with the product as I build it. I want great developer experience. So what this means to me in terms of building static sites is a few things. One, I want to be able to use JavaScript to its fullest. If anyone here has ever used other templating languages, like Handlebars, or if you've built a Jekyll site and you've used Liquid templates, or you've used any of these other templating languages that intentionally dumb down what you can do, you may have been frustrated. Maybe you love them. I was frustrated. I really like having all of JavaScript accessible to me when I'm building a web UI. I also want to use my existing knowledge. Again, if I want to build a static site right now, there are thousands of static site generators out there. There are a bunch of them. There are a bunch that are really well supported. There are a bunch of them with tons and tons of stars on GitHub. And they're all there for me to use, but they all have a certain learning curve to them. And what kind of irked me about learning this new tech was not that I don't want to learn new stuff. Learning new stuff is great. But it was the fact that as someone who works a lot with React and JavaScript, I know how to build really rich UIs. I already know how to do that. And I like doing it, and it's fun. And the developer experience is great. So why would I go learn something that might not even be as powerful as what I already know? I want to write once. And this one is going to bear a bit more explanation, and we'll get into it throughout the slides. But I essentially don't want to write too much code to generate my static site that is not the same code as I'm building my UI with. In an ideal world, I just want to write the code to build a UI, write a React app, and hit a button, and it becomes a full-blown static website. And of course, all this other good stuff that you may or may not have heard a lot about. There's been a lot of progress in dev tooling in JavaScript recently. You got hot reloading, you got modularized code, you've got ECMAScript 6, all this good stuff. We want it, obviously, because these don't even feel like new ideas, considering how fast JavaScript moves. So React gives us a lot of that developer experience right out of the box. It's great. I love React. So this is what I kind of saw in my mind, was that this space, this intersection of React and static, was actually a really nice place to be. All the benefits of a static website, plus all the benefits of React just being a super fun platform to work with. So this is what I wanted to do at this point, but I wasn't yet sure how I was going to do it. So before we dive into how we can build static sites with React, have a great developer experience, and get all those benefits, let's just talk briefly about, has this been done before? And there have been a number of projects that deal with React as the templating engine to generate static sites. And that's really cool. I'm glad other people have looked into it. And maybe even now there's the perfect solution that I would love, and I just don't know about it because I looked at this 3 months ago, and 3 months in JavaScript land is a really long time. But a lot of solutions I saw were they're using render to static markup, which, if you don't know, is a really useful tool, but it tells React, hey, don't manage this DOM. Don't do your React stuff. Don't attach event listeners or do any of that. Just turn it into a string of HTML that I'll go do whatever I want with. And that didn't feel right to me because we love using React on the client side. I love using React on the client side. You can build amazing applications with it. So why would we use it now just to generate static files, but not have it manage the output of those static files once it's in a browser? And then I was also a bit turned off by where you put things on the file system, directory structures, conventions surrounding static site generation, which if you've ever used a static site generator, you probably know about. You have to put your markdown files here, and then it turns into this URL structure down the road. And nothing's wrong with that, but again, it didn't feel right. It didn't feel like it was the best experience we could get given React and the front-end ecosystem and the state of tooling right now. So let's dive into building a static site with React. Let's actually look at some code. And when I started thinking about this, I kind of looked at it from the perspective of what do I know I can do already? I never thought it would be impossible to generate a static site, but it was kind of like, well, how should I do it? What's the best way? What's going to give me a great experience as a developer? So existing tools that we have available to us as developers if we want to essentially turn a React component into an HTML file. Well, people are doing this with universal JavaScript already. Essentially, if you're server-side rendering, then you're doing this almost, except instead of outputting to a static file, you're just sending the string value of your components back in a response to a browser. So we can just piggyback on top of universal JavaScript, server-side rendering, and do exactly what they're doing, which is just use these two methods that React gives us, render to string and render to static markup. And then, of course, we have Node, because, again, if we're doing server-side rendering, we're doing it in Node. And so if we're writing files to disk based on React components, then we're probably going to be doing it in Node, and we will. And Node gives us the FS module, which lets us write files. So I knew that we have these two things. I'm sure we can do it. Let's figure out how we can best make it happen. Let's look at this super complex React component we got here. We've got our app, consists of two tags, a div with a class, and an h1 tag with some text in it. If anyone's not familiar, this is ECMAScript 6 syntax, just using a function to return some JSX, and React knows how to handle this as of 0.14. It's really nice. It's more readable, but essentially it just is the same as React.createClass with a render method that returns what this function returns. Okay, cool. We've got a component, we've got an app. Let's turn it into an HTML file. So we can do that. It's not a big feat. We just import the React DOM and import the file system module, and then we can write this file out to disk. We can write out index.html and set its contents equal to the string value of our app component, which is it's cool. Nice. We've got a static site, right? Let's check it out. So this is what our site looks like right now. And it doesn't look right, at least not to me, because it's not a document. React did exactly what we would expect it to do. It produced this nice markup for us, but this isn't an HTML document. You could load this in a browser, and it would almost certainly load because browsers are super forgiving of all the terrible HTML that's ever been written in the past. So it would load this, but maybe there's an inconsistent experience there. Maybe we just want to write good code instead. So let's iterate on this and make it better. We need to wrap this in an HTML document, essentially. So to do that, let's create another. You can create another component that does exactly that. We've got same thing happening. We just make this function called HTML that takes in props, and it's going to return a bunch of JSX. But the only trick here is that we're using the aptly named dangerously set inner HTML property because we want to just throw a string in there and have it rendered as that string. And the reason, if anyone's wondering why this isn't dangerous, or why we're assuming this isn't dangerous, is because we assume we provide this string. It's not user provided data. So ideally, no one's putting a bunch of weird stuff into our DOM. All right, now we've got this HTML component. Let's make it happen. So we import all the things we need at the top, then we take our app component, and we save that string value, and just call it body. We save that so that we can then pass it into, we're making our document down here. And the thing to notice here is that we actually use both of these two methods that we have available to us. We use render2string and render2static markup, because we don't actually want React trying to control every single tag in our document. We don't want to try to control anything above the body. We don't even want it to try to control body, because as I'm sure some of you have seen before, if React is trying to control a certain piece of DOM, and some other script from somewhere else on the web page or a browser extension or whatever comes and messes with their DOM, React outputs some really scary error messages in the console, and you have runtime errors, which is no fun for anyone. It sucks for the devs, it sucks for the users, it's all bad. So we just want static markup for that wrapping document, but then for our app, we still use render2string because we want React to be able to grab onto it once it's loaded into a browser. And looking at the output of this, this is an actual HTML document. This is exciting because at this point, so I was actually going through this process when I was trying to figure out how I want to handle static sites in React. And so I got here and I opened it up with, from the command line, just open in browser, and it rendered, and it wasn't loading any script tags. The script tag was not found, but it still rendered. And that was really exciting because it was all built with React, and JavaScript was completely broken, and it was still rendering. So at this point, I had a lot of those benefits of static sites. At this point, if we were to stop here, we have our component turning into a HTML file, that's what we wanted to do. And this gives us all of those benefits that we talked about of static sites. It's a static HTML file, so assumedly any search engine on the web, not just Google, but any of them like Yahoo or Bing or Yandex or Baidu or any search engine that exists that we don't even know about can handle this. They don't have to worry about our JavaScript, and we don't have to worry either. And that's cool, but it doesn't seem very flexible. And there would certainly be some overhead if we wanted to do things like output other files, not just index.html. So there are some trade-offs here, and we also haven't talked about the developer experience, which, of course, we want to talk about, and multi-page sites. Like I said, if we want to output an about.html, how do we do that? It's certainly not hard to imagine. We just can make a different script that outputs the about.html, and eventually we could probably just build up some map or some JavaScript object that mapped all the pages we want to some components, and that would work fine. But that sounded like more work than is necessary, at least to me at the time. I didn't want to have to build those data structures because it seems like there's probably a solution out there already. So for multi-page sites, there is a solution, which is React Router. And you guys heard about this earlier, and if you've been developing in React for long enough, you've likely used React Router. It is the de facto router in the React community right now. It's good, it works, and most importantly, it does server-side rendering for us. So before we talk about React Router, let's just, what do routes look like in React Router? They look like this. They're just JSX with a top-level route that has routes inside of it. And each of those routes can also have routes inside of them. And you can have this crazy nested data structure, which is good because you probably want nested routes depending on the complexity of your app. And this is a very declarative and easy way to describe it. So in this particular example, we describe our route path and the component it's going to render. We give it an index route, which says, okay, now within that component, render this one when you're at that root route. But If you go to, say, about, then it's going to instead render the about component. And then, just to be safe, we throw in a catch-all. It's a client-side 404 that says, match anything. Anything else that's not matched above, give us the not found component. So the benefits of React Router. I honestly didn't like that I was just saying, okay, let's use this library, because of how fast JavaScript moves, as I'm sure everyone here knows, you don't want to attach yourself to one library. Even React. React is super strong, and it's been around for years now. But there's always this nagging fear that the thing we're learning now is going to be obsolete soon. So I don't think React Router will be, but it's just a caveat. We are depending on this library to make our lives easier, but we're just going to ignore that for now. So what can React Router do for us? It can describe our routes, as we saw. It can describe nested routes, which is super important. Imagine if you want to, generating index.html was pretty simple, but what if you have a bunch of posts, you want to make a blog, and you want all of these posts to be at a URL that says posts/name of your post. You now need a post folder with a bunch of static post.html files inside of it. And that also doesn't sound that hard, but the key is we want to be able to arbitrarily nest our routes and nest our files. And we want flexibility. We don't want to be limited by our own ability to write recursive algorithms to generate these files for us. And React Router works on the server. This is important because up till now, just exploring how we want to render static files, we've used all of these techniques that people use on the server side. And the fact that React Router works on the server almost instantly tells us that we can use it to render static files. It'll let us match routes and take a component out of that and render it to a string. So just a quick look at an oversimplified example of what that looks like is this is entirely contrived because I'm passing it one single location when the idea is that you want it to be able to take in any location and tell you the route. But just as an example, React Router gives us this match function, which will take a string that is a route and hand you back the component. And if it's not matched, it'll hand you back the not found component. And this is all really nice because if we had all of these string values of our routes, say if we knew every single route in our app that it was ever going to have, and we wrote a React Router config to handle all those routes, then we could use this method to get HTML file, a static representation of every path in our app, which is what we want. Okay, so building on that idea, let's look at this router config again and think about the routes that it's representing. We have our index route, which is just a slash. Then we have the top level route is just a slash. We have this index route below it, which maps to the same thing, so it's just a duplicate route. It's also the slash. And then we've got about, which maps to slash about, and the catch-all, which doesn't specifically map to anything, it just maps to everything else that wasn't matched above. And if I go over, so in my mind, this is what I was thinking. We have all these routes that match, that map to, they map to these strings for us. We're describing what our site looks like, and thought, well, we're already describing it. Why can't we just turn that into HTML? Why can't this just turn into a static site and turn into these pages up here? And it actually can. I don't know if it was too much of a revelation. I was just excited to make it happen. We can absolutely just use a React Router config to generate an entire static site based on our routes, which to me goes back to what I was talking about at the very beginning, which is one of the goals from a developer standpoint is to write it once. Not to write a bunch of code that's specific to the static generation of my site, but to just write an app, client-side app, that can then turn into a static site, because client-side apps describe UI. They describe what an HTML file should look like. So before we go a bit more into what we can do this, right? But how? Before we go into that, let's go back to the developer experience. Now, what were the things that we wanted, or I wanted, when I was thinking about static sites and React and the intersection between the two? So I want the full power of JavaScript. I want to use existing knowledge to write it once, hot reloading, etc. So where are we at now? Oh, because we're using React, we have the full power of JavaScript. Because also we already know React, so we're using existing knowledge. But if you already know React Router, that's more existing knowledge that you can leverage to build your static sites. And of course, any React component you've ever used, you can use to put out output HTML, and then once it gets rendered in the browser, React will hook up to it, and it'll have all the functionality you expect. So I think at this point, we've done pretty well in the use existing knowledge camp. The writing once, though, and as I've said, we can do this, but we don't yet know how. So for now, that's just going to be a question mark. And all the hot reloading, etc. This stuff, I mentioned it's been around for at least a few months, which is a while, right? So it's been around. There are solutions for this. And specifically, this ties into your tooling stack. And if you're a JavaScript dev today, my guess would be that you're using either Webpack or Browserify. Those aren't the only ones out there, but they are the most popular right now. And they can both solve this last bullet point. And for me, at work and in my personal projects, the one I use is Webpack. So that's the route I decided to go with this particular experiment in building static sites. This is not to say Webpack is better than Browserify, because there are holy wars that have been fought on forums about which one is better and which one is more modular. But this is the one I chose. And so if you're using Browserify, I bet you can do all the same stuff. And using Webpack, because it bundles stuff for us and it handles actually turning a bunch of JavaScript into a bundle, a string, it can also handle turning a bunch of components into strings. And by default, it just writes all this stuff to disk. So I knew the functionality was there. It's doing what we want. And it has a plugin architecture that allows us to just write arbitrary plugins and hook into its build process and output files to do whatever we want. So going back real quick to the developer experience, this is what it looks like in my mind after introducing Webpack, because the last bullet point there is an easy one. Webpack does all that. The second to last of the write once, that's what we're going to talk about now. That is what we can do we can essentially write a plugin to do what I was just talking about. Give me all the routes, and then turn those into strings, and then match them against components, render those all out to static files. So this is the super brief, non-explanatory overview of what we're doing. We want to take that React config and get a list of routes. We want to iterate that list and use React Router's match function to match every one of those strings. And then we save those. Once we match a string, we get the component. We can get the string value of that component by using React's render to string methods. And then we can save that string to an HTML file to disk, which is really cool. And because we're using React Router and Webpack in tandem, Webpack is super good at writing files to disk. It does that all day. And React Router is super good at representing nested routes. And the combination of those two actually makes it so you can arbitrarily nest your routes, and you'll get arbitrarily nested HTML files out, which it's super useful. I was actually surprised when I saw that we could do this, because it was actually a lot less logic that was required to make this work. Webpack essentially just did it for us. So I'm not going to go into the actual logic of doing any of these things, mainly because it is online for anyone who's interested. Just an open source plugin I made for Webpack that will turn all your routes into static files. It's not that complex. It just recurses over and gets a bunch of strings. So once we have that, it doesn't even have to be a plugin for Webpack. It could be just any arbitrary piece of code that is reproducible. The libraries say, what does it look like now if we want to use React in tandem with React Router to build a static site? So we build a front-end app. Everyone here knows how to build React apps. You build that app. You use React Router. It's got really cool routing that goes really fast, and it's all instant because it's all JavaScript based. Then you run npm run build. You get a static site back, and then you deploy that static site. This is what I was really excited about because I wanted static sites to become more of an implementation detail or a build step, not something you have to worry about, something that can just happen naturally because of the tools you're using and because you're using existing knowledge and because as front-end developers you're describing UIs and describing HTML already. So let's just have the computer look at all that and say, all right, these are the files we want. And in my experience, this is just essentially just an experiment, a proof of concept still, but it's absolutely worked. And it's worked to build the website for my company as well as my own personal website, which I rewrote it was last Sunday. I thought I should probably get that site up before the conference, and I did, and I used this, and it was a lot of fun. So, coming back to, I've talked a lot about how great static is, but the reality is that servers are still cool. There is nothing wrong with servers because a lot of apps actually require a server. That's not where this is going, but servers are cool. But do you really need one? This is a question where the answer in the past was almost always a resounding yes, I need that server, and that's totally fair. But when I look at things like WordPress or just CMSs in general, they're usually rendering content that never changes, and they're pulling it from a database, so yeah, they have a backend, but it doesn't seem like an absolute necessity. You could just write all of these. Let's say it's a blog. You can write all these posts, as people do with static site generators. You can write it to disk somewhere, and then at build time, you just say build, it makes you a site, and then you deploy it. Why do we need a backend for that? So just to go over a few use cases, may or may not be obvious. They're blogs, of course. Blogs are a big one. Static sites love blogs. There are marketing websites, anything that is essentially a brochure that it just exists online. Documentation, also a huge one, and there are full static site generators just to make documentation already. So it's a fairly busy space in the open source community because open source projects love to have documentation, and so all these people that build cool open source projects end up building documentation generators. But it's something that static sites are great for. Email sign-up pages, this one may be a little less obvious because you actually can have functionality that would require a server. Contact forms, etc. There are a lot of use cases here, and I think we don't even know what they all are yet. And part of the reason for this, part of the reason I would say you may not need a server, you might, but you might not, is because there's this ecosystem that exists around static right now that's evolving, and it's gotten a lot more mature in recent years. So we've got online forum services. I don't use these, so I'm not sure what they are. I think Wufoo might be an example. You've got static site hosts. GitHub Pages is one. It's not even their core business, but they do this. It's free. It's great. You've got Netlify is another one. Surge.sh, free. You just run a command line tool, and it puts your site up online. Common services, Discuss has been around for a while. There are probably others, but again, you can just put those on static sites because they have their own backend, and they can worry about it. More recently, AWS Lambda and AWS API Gateway. I don't know if Google or any other cloud providers have gotten into this yet, but Lambda's pretty cool. It's just your whole service is essentially a function, and you only run it when you use it. But API Gateway took that cool functionality that wasn't that useful and added API endpoints to it, so it got way more useful. But AWS is still kind of a beast and something that you can have an entire career in knowing AWS. So recently, there's also this cool framework that emerged around building much more rich apps that require server-side functionality, but all with Lambdas, which means you can have a static site that just talks to your Lambdas. So that's my talk. This is who I am. If you want to talk more about this, I'm really excited about it. These are ways you can contact me, and if you want these slides, this was a React app, if anyone couldn't tell. These slides are all up on my GitHub, if anyone wants to check them out, and there are actual clickable links inside the slides. Yeah, thank you.